It was one of those Tennessee evenings that looked harmless. The air was thick, heavy with summer heat, and the sound of cicadas carried through the empty streets of Knoxville. 17-year-old Laura Bennett stepped out of her front door, waving to her parents as she headed to the convenience store down the block. Her father, Frank Bennett, called after her half a joke, half a warning. "Don't be long, kiddo." She smiled, said she'd be right back, and disappeared around the corner. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By the time the sun began to set, her mother Eleanor started pacing. The store was only a few minutes away. The phone call to her friends led to silence. The second call, to the store clerk, came with a simple, gut-wrenching answer. She left 20 minutes ago. In that moment, Eleanor felt something inside her break. Parents know when something's wrong, not because of evidence, not because of logic, but because of that crushing pull in their chest that says, "This isn't right." When Frank drove down those same streets searching for headlights, his knuckles gripped the steering wheel so tight they turned white. The town that had always felt safe suddenly looked different. Streetlights flickered. Every corner held the question no one wanted to ask: where was Laura? By midnight, neighbors joined the search. Flashlights moved through fields and ditches. Her name was shouted into the still, humid air. The police arrived, asking questions that didn't have answers yet. But the one detail that stood out came from a passerby, a blue sedan seen slowing near the corner. Laura took that night. No one caught the plate. No one saw who drove it. The world kept turning. The cicadas kept singing. But the Bennett house went silent. Have you ever watched someone walk out your door and never return? By the next morning, that small stretch of Knoxville felt like a wound no one could close. Patrol cars lined the curb outside the Bennett home, their flashing lights turning the house into a cruel reminder of everything that could go wrong in a single night. Eleanor hadn't slept. Her voice was gone from calling her daughter's name for hours, and her hands trembled as she held the phone that refused to ring. Detective Harold Thorne and his partner, Lydia Mills, took the case within hours. They combed the route between the Bennett's home and the store, a path less than half a mile long, and found Laura's bag near an alley drain. Its contents were scattered: a wallet, lip balm, a crumpled store receipt. Missing was the silver locket she wore every day since she was 13, a gift from her grandmother. Reporters arrived before sunrise. Cameras clicked while Eleanor sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket she didn't need, staring at the street like she could will her daughter back home. Neighbors whispered about strangers seen in town, others about old grudges, and some avoided eye contact altogether because they didn't know what to say to a mother whose child had vanished. By noon, the first press conference began. Thorne's voice was steady, but his eyes gave him away. "We are treating this as a missing person case," he said, but the tone beneath it was dread. They found faint tire tracks near the alley and a single footprint half smudged by rain. It was all they had, that, and a feeling that time was already slipping away. The heat, the silence, the helplessness, it all pressed down until even the air seemed too heavy to breathe. By nightfall, the search turned desperate. Volunteers with flashlights fanned out through back roads, overgrown lots, and creek banks. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance. Someone shouted they'd found something, and for a second, hope cut through the air like lightning. But it wasn't Laura. It was her locket, half buried in the mud beside the river's edge, its chain snapped clean through. Inside, the photo of her and her parents was soaked, but still visible, her smile frozen in time. When Detective Thorne handed that locket back to Eleanor, she didn't cry. She just whispered she never took it off. That was when everyone in the room understood. Whatever had happened to Laura, it wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. The media spun headlines for weeks, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. There was nothing left to find. The car, the driver, the motive, all vanished as quickly as she had. And as the police lines were taken down and the neighborhood returned to its quiet routines, the Bennett's home became something else entirely, a shrine to the life that stopped halfway down a sunlit street. People in town still talk about that summer, the way the air felt charged, the way every parent started waiting by their door just a little longer. Because when one girl disappeared, it wasn't just Laura who was gone, it was the town's sense of safety that went with her. Have you ever watched someone walk out your door and never return? She thought safety lived in familiar streets. She was wrong. Subscribe now, because sometimes danger wears the face you already trust. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The investigation into Laura Bennett's disappearance began with fury and faded with exhaustion. The first week brought chaos. The Knoxville PD was flooded with calls, tips, and theories. Everyone had seen something, and none of it matched. A woman swore she saw a man dragging a girl into a blue sedan near the old gas station. A teenager claimed Laura had been arguing with someone near the store's back entrance. Others blamed out-of-towners passing through on the interstate. It was all noise, frantic, desperate, and useless. Detective Harold Thorne, a man who'd seen enough tragedy to know what false hope sounded like, found himself clinging to every lead anyway. His partner, Lydia Mills, younger and relentless, scribbled names and license plates in a notebook until the ink bled through the pages. Each clue burned out within hours. The blue sedan belonged to a delivery driver who'd been working across town. The man near the store was a homeless veteran with no connection to Laura. Each time, they came back empty-handed, faces lying deeper, hearts heavier. Meanwhile, the Bennetts began to break under the weight of time. Eleanor stopped eating. Frank stopped sleeping. The front porch, once their evening ritual, became a place where silence replaced conversation. Each sunset came with the same thought, maybe tonight she'll walk through the door. But the door stayed closed, and every time the phone rang, it wasn't news. It was another reporter, another question, another reminder that their daughter was still missing. By August, the heat pressed down like a curse. Tempers flared. Neighbors whispered about police failure, and some even turned on the Bennetts, accusing them of knowing more than they said. That's what happens when a community runs out of answers. They turn their suspicion on grief itself. By late summer, the case began to eat itself alive. Reports contradicted each other, statements got lost, and the press turned the tragedy into a spectacle. Each headline shouted louder than the last. Teen vanishes in broad daylight. Police baffled by missing girl. But behind the noise, the investigation was running on fumes. Detective Thorne grew more withdrawn. He was the kind of man who believed every case could be solved with enough patience, but this one felt cursed. His partner Mills was still chasing down witnesses, following maps, marking locations on the precinct wall until it looked like a maze of failure. The leads kept collapsing. Tire tracks by the alley had been contaminated before the lab could run a full test. The security camera at the store had malfunctioned that night. The one eyewitness who claimed to see Laura arguing with someone recanted, saying she'd been confused. Inside the department, whispers started about mistakes, about oversight. The mayor's office began calling daily, demanding updates that didn't exist. The chief ordered Thorne to shift focus to other cases. That's when he snapped. "We're talking about an 18-year-old girl," he shouted in the hallway. "Not a report you can file away." But the truth was, the city had moved on. Eleanor Bennett didn't. She called every day for months. Sometimes she didn't say anything, just silence on the other end, like she couldn't hang up. Frank started drinking, his guilt heavy with every missed call and false lead. When reporters stopped showing up, the Bennetts knew the world had already buried their daughter in its own way, not in a grave, but in indifference. By November, the case had lost its pulse. The detectives boxed the evidence, logged it, and placed it on the back shelf. Case status: inactive. By the time winter crept over Knoxville, the Bennett house had grown colder than the season itself. The porch light, once a quiet symbol of hope, burned 24 hours a day. Its glow a plea. No one answered. Neighbors had stopped dropping by. Friends who once promised help now sent cards instead. Every word they wrote carried the same emptiness. "We're praying for answers." But prayers had gone unanswered for months. Detective Thorne drove past the Bennett's home often, though he never stopped. He couldn't bear to look Eleanor in the eye anymore. The case file on his desk stared back at him each morning, A thin stack of paper that had somehow grown heavier with time. He knew what every detective fears but never admits. Sometimes, justice doesn't come. Sometimes, the world forgets. Lydia Mills tried to keep the flame alive. She fought for lab work, pushed for follow-ups, begged for funding, but the department's silence was louder than her words. One night, she found Thorne sitting alone in the precinct, still staring at the evidence board. "We failed her," he said, voice low and steady. "We let her vanish twice, once in the street and once in the system." She didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. As the holidays arrived, the Bennetts pretended for the sake of routine. They decorated the tree with ornaments that once made Laura laugh, the paper angel she'd made in Sunday school, the tiny snow globe she'd saved her allowance to buy. But the sound of carols outside made Eleanor flinch. She said every song felt like mockery, now joy, in a world that had taken everything from her. The town had stopped talking about Laura Bennett. New crimes filled the papers. Time did what it always does. It dulled everyone's memory, except for those who lost her. In February, nearly a year after the night she disappeared, Detective Thorne signed the closure notice. He did it because he had to, not because he believed in it. The file was boxed, labeled, and shelved evidence that the city had turned its back. But grief doesn't wait for permission to exist. It lingers in the walls, in every silence that lasts too long, in every door that opens to no one. For the Bennetts, time stopped moving that night, and no report, no policy, no apology could bring it back. The case froze, but grief never did. Would you keep fighting if no one believed your child was still worth finding? Time didn't heal Knoxville, it hollowed it. After Laura Bennett's case went cold, the city learned how to forget. New buildings rose. Streets were renamed. But every so often, someone would still glance at the old missing posters, half torn on the side of the post office wall. Faded, water-stained, her face still lingered there like a question no one dared to ask anymore. Detective Harold Thorne left the force in 1990. They said he retired, but the truth was simpler: he broke. Years of chasing ghosts, of trying to resurrect a girl the world had buried, left him hollow. Still, every March 12th, he drove past the empty lot where Laura's bag was found, parked his car, and sat there until sunset. He called it keeping her company. For Eleanor Bennett, grief became ritual. She never moved from the old brick house on Carter Avenue. She cooked for two, talked to shadows, and left the porch light burning long after her neighbors turned theirs off. Each night, she whispered the same words, "Come home, baby." The house listened, but the world didn't. Knoxville's memory began to fade. The new generation didn't know her name. For them, Laura was a story their parents warned them about. The girl who never made it home. Some said she ran away. Others whispered she'd been taken by someone passing through town. The truth had become folklore, polished by distance and disbelief. In the late 90s, one teacher even told her students the story as a cautionary tale. Always tell your parents where you're going. Bad things happen when you don't. Laura's tragedy had been turned into a lesson stripped of her humanity, reduced to warning words. And yet, in the Bennett house, the calendar never turned. A single photo remained on the mantel. Laura at 17, her smile caught between innocence and the first taste of adulthood. Her mother dusted it every morning, like it was sacred. Detective Thorne still called Eleanor every few months, even when there was nothing new to say. "You still keeping that light on?" he'd ask. "Always," she'd reply. Both knew what the words really meant. Neither of them had ever stopped waiting. By the time the new millennium arrived, the case file labeled Bennett L. had gathered 2 inches of dust in the archives of the Knoxville Police Department. Most officers didn't even recognize the name. But Harold Thorne couldn't forget, not the scent of rain that night, not the look on Eleanor Bennett's face when he told her they had no leads left. Guilt clung to him like a second skin. He spent retirement walking the same streets he once searched with flashlights and broken promises. Locals said he'd become a ghost himself, talking to the air, whispering apologies to a girl long gone. In 2004, a young recruit named Eric Finch, joined the department, and found Thorne sitting in the evidence room, staring at a single sealed box. When Finch asked why he still came back, Thorne's answer was quiet but sharp. Because no one else will. That moment became a vow. Finch told himself that if science ever caught up to justice, he'd bring Laura Bennett home. But years passed, and science still moved slower than memory. Eleanor aged into silence. Her hands, once restless, grew frail. Her voice weaker. Yet every birthday, she baked Laura's favorite cake chocolate with raspberry frosting and set a single plate for her daughter at the table. No one came to eat it, but she said it made her feel less alone. The neighborhood changed. The old market became a chain store, the high school was rebuilt, and most who'd known Laura had either moved away or died. Only the light on Carter Avenue stayed the same, a small bulb burning through 4 decades, surviving storms, blackouts, and the slow rot of time. By 2017, Finch had become head of the cold case division. He remembered Thorne's words like scripture. When the new forensic genealogy program launched, he requested to reopen select cases, and at the very top of his list was Laura Bennett, 1,983. His team found the box still sealed, tagged, and forgotten. The ink on the label had nearly faded, but the number 83147B still burned clear. Finch lifted the evidence envelope gently, holding it as if it could shatter. "You waited long enough," he said under his breath. The room was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. After 40 years, someone had finally decided to listen. The ghosts of Knoxville stirred. In early spring of 2017, Knoxville's air felt different, sharp, alive, restless. For the first time in years, Detective Eric Finch felt that same electricity he'd once read about in Thorne's old reports, the quiet hum before a truth begins to rise. The cold case unit had just received state funding for advanced forensic sequencing. Finch stood before his team, holding the brown, time-worn evidence box that had been ignored for nearly 4 decades. "This one," he said. "She's waited long enough." Inside were only a few items: Laura's torn scarf, a small silver locket, and fragments of evidence too degraded for testing in the 80 seconds. But science had evolved, and hope no longer needed miracles, just persistence. Finch sent the samples to the new forensic lab in Nashville, requesting next-generation genome sequencing, a technique powerful enough to pull a whisper from the dead. The waiting was excruciating. Weeks turned into months. Finch grew restless, walking the halls of the station every night, rereading the case files until the pages blurred. He wasn't haunted by failure, he was haunted by silence, the kind that follows when a city chooses to stop remembering. On a rainy afternoon in September, the call finally came. The DNA was viable. The analyst's voice trembled as she said it. "Detective, we have something." It wasn't a match yet, just a thread, faint but real, linking Laura's case to a familial DNA profile stored in a national database. A cousin, a branch of a tree that led somewhere back to Knoxville. Finch froze, staring at the evidence photo of Laura's scarf spread across his desk. For the first time in 40 years, he felt something shift in the air. The world had tried to bury her story, but science had remembered. He whispered the words Thorne once said, "Justice doesn't forget." For 40 years, her killer smiled through neighborhood fences. If he could hide that long, who's hiding near you? Subscribe, stay aware. The past doesn't disappear. It just waits for science to catch up. Detective Eric Finch stood under the buzzing lights of the cold case archive, the scent of old paper and dust settling like time itself. In his hands was a thin folder marked with a fading yellow sticker, "Open Evidence Bennett, 1,983, the yellow file." It was a name whispered between generations of detectives, the one case they said was cursed. But Finch didn't believe in curses. He believed in patience and in progress. He slid the folder open carefully, each photograph and report whispering fragments of a story unfinished, crime scene photos, witness lists. The autopsy summary from a time when forensics was still learning to speak. Everything that had once been limits partial DNA, missing fibers, unidentified prints was now an opportunity. The past had been deaf to the truth, but science had finally found its voice. Finch made one call to Dr. Alara Vance, a molecular biologist specializing in forensic genome sequencing at Vanderbilt University. She was known for resurrecting forgotten cases, crimes from decades ago that technology could finally speak for. When she answered, her first words weren't polite or curious. They were determined. "Send me everything," she said. "If there's truth left in that box, we'll find it." A week later, Finch stood in the sterile hum of her lab. Under the cold glow of magnifiers, the fragments of Laura Bennett's life lay before them, her scarf, her locket, and a single nail clipping scraped from her right hand. "This," Vance said softly, holding it up with tweezers, "is where she fought." They extracted what older labs had dismissed as contamination, a faint trace of touch DNA, skin cells buried under layers of time and decay. It wasn't much, but to Finch, it was everything. Vance worked through nights, running the samples through mitochondrial sequencing, mapping every genetic whisper against databases that hadn't even existed when Laura disappeared. Days turned into weeks. Data filled screens, lines connecting to names, names to families, families to generations. The first hit came through a genealogy upload, a distant match, not to a suspect, but to a local family with roots buried deep in Knoxville. Finch's pulse quickened. Science had cracked the silence open. The results didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no drumbeat, no cinematic moment, just the quiet ping of an email notification in the corner of Dr. Vance's screen. She opened it and stared, her hand frozen on the mouse. "We've got it," she whispered. The partial match led to a family name that every longtime resident of Knoxville knew: the Sterlings. A respected lineage that had lived in East Tennessee for generations, their name woven through church pews, town records, and civic donations. Finch leaned closer as the database loaded the full ancestry profile. A branching tree filled the screen, hundreds of names connected by faint gray lines, each narrowing down through cousins and siblings, until one strand stood out in bold: Victor Sterling. "Who is he?" Vance asked. Finch didn't answer immediately. He knew the name. Everyone did. Former principal at Riverview High, church deacon, volunteer coordinator, the kind of man who organized food drives and taught Sunday school. He was the smiling face in every old newspaper photo, the voice calling for unity during times of tragedy. Finch's jaw clenched. He was the one who ran the memorial service for Laura, he said quietly. He read the eulogy. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. All the years, all the searches, all the vigils, and the man standing at the microphone back then had been the one responsible for the reason they gathered in grief. Vance leaned back, her eyes distant but steady. "That's the thing about DNA," she said softly. "It doesn't care about reputation. It just tells the truth." They ran secondary verification through the national database, and the match deepened 99.98% certainty. Finch stared at the screen until his vision blurred. It wasn't shock. It was rage, mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the dull ache of vindication that felt too heavy to celebrate. For decades, this man had attended police fundraisers, handed out scholarships in Laura's name, and built a career around community trust. He wasn't a stranger. He was the foundation everyone leaned on. Finch closed the folder, his voice a low whisper. It was never a ghost. It was one of us. The night before they made their move, Detective Finch couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, surrounded by files spread across the desk, the same ones that had haunted every detective before him. But now, every photograph, every faded report, every unanswered question finally had direction. The name Victor Sterling wasn't just ink on paper anymore. It was a pulse, a heartbeat buried under decades of polite silence. Dr. Vance had been cautious, insisting they needed fresh DNA to confirm what the genetic mapping had already screamed. Finch agreed. A match this explosive demanded precision. They couldn't afford to stumble. Not now. So, they watched Sterling. For weeks. Surveillance teams followed him from his tidy suburban home to the school board meetings he still attended, to the coffee shop where he sat with his usual morning paper. He was ordinary, unbothered, smiling the picture of normalcy. Until one morning, he tossed a disposable cup into a public bin outside the cafe. Finch retrieved it moments later, sealing it in an evidence bag with trembling hands. In the sterile hum of the lab, Dr. Vance ran the final comparison. The machines clicked, hummed, and then stilled. The result blinked onto the screen like a confession written in light. 100% DNA match. Finch didn't speak, neither did Vance. The silence was heavier than grief. It was history catching up. In that moment, the years of waiting collapsed into one undeniable truth. The man who had stood at the heart of every vigil, who had offered condolences to Laura's mother, who had shaped the minds of children, was the one who had taken Laura's life. The ghost had a name, and it belonged to the town itself. In small towns like Knoxville, trust isn't just earned, it's inherited. People grow up believing in familiar faces, the ones who've always been there. And no face was more familiar than Barney Croft, the quiet mechanic who owned the service station off Magnolia Avenue. He was dependable, polite, and steady, the kind of man people waved to without thinking. Parents sent their kids to him when their cars broke down, and he never overcharged a dime. To the town, Barney was what safety looked like. He'd been part of every community event since the early 80 seconds. At Laura Bennett's memorial service, he stood in the crowd like everyone else, hands folded, face solemn. When people brought casseroles to her family's home, he helped unload them. When the search parties gathered, his pickup truck was always there, headlights cutting through the darkness. No one ever questioned him. Why would they? Barney Croft was kindness itself, a man who fixed problems. But kindness can camouflage cruelty. Detective Finch didn't see it at first either. The DNA hit that connected to Victor Sterling's family line wasn't isolated. It traced back further, splitting through branches and cousins until one name repeated through several connected records: Barnaby Croft. It was distant, but undeniable. The match from Laura's fingernail sample and the familial genetic tracing pointed toward the Croft bloodline, not through Sterling's side, but through a shared ancestry that wound back to a forgotten cousinhood between the two families. It was the first thread of horror. Finch leaned back in his chair, staring at Croft's name glowing on the screen. Barney Croft, he murmured. The man who helped us search for her. The kind mechanic wasn't a bystander to tragedy. He'd been the architect of it. The moment Barnaby Croft's name surfaced, Finch felt the air shift in the precinct. It wasn't excitement, it was disbelief. Everyone knew him. Half the department had trusted their cars to his garage. He'd fixed patrol engines for years, even offered discounts for officers' families. To suspect him felt like suspecting the heartbeat of the town itself, but the data didn't care about feelings. The genetic chain was clear. Surveillance began quietly. Croft's routine was as predictable as clockwork. He opened the garage at 7, took lunch at noon, and closed before dusk. He attended church every Sunday and drank the same black coffee every morning from the diner down the street. Finch and his team rotated shifts, tracking his movements from unmarked cars. They watched the man who waved at every passing driver, who handed out free oil changes to single mothers, who smiled at children as they walked past his shop. On the third week of surveillance, opportunity came. Croft finished his meal at the diner, folded the napkin neatly, and dropped his coffee cup into the trash on his way out. Finch waited until Croft's truck disappeared down the road, then slipped inside. The waitress gave him a curious glance as he pulled on gloves. He didn't say a word. He just took the cup, sealed it in a plastic bag, and left. At the state lab, the air felt charged. Dr. Vance herself handled the sample, the hum of the sequencing machine cutting through the tension. Finch stood behind her, silent. The seconds stretched, long enough for the weight of 20 years to press down on him. Then the result flashed across the monitor. 100% match. Finch exhaled through clenched teeth. His throat tightened as the truth settled. The man who had offered him coffee during the original search. The man who'd comforted Laura's parents. The man who said, "We'll find her, detective." They'd found him instead. When the confirmation came through, Finch didn't feel triumph, only silence. 20 years of chasing shadows, of sleepless nights, replaying the same failure. had finally led to one name. But instead of relief, it brought nausea. He had shaken this man's hand. He had stood beside him at community events. He'd accepted his donations for search efforts. Every word, every gesture of sympathy had been performance rehearsed, calculated, a predator pretending to care. Finch sat in his car outside Croft's garage that night, watching through the windshield. The mechanic moved easily through the space, hands steady, wiping grease off a set of wrenches like nothing in his world had ever gone wrong. Customers waved on their way home, headlights reflecting off his easy smile. He didn't look like guilt. He looked like belonging. That was what made it unbearable. Detective Finch whispered to himself, almost as a vow, "You smiled at her parents while you buried their child." He remembered Eleanor Bennett's face, her hollow stare at every press conference, her trembling voice when she said, "Don't let her become a story." Finch had promised her he wouldn't. Now, after 2 decades, he could finally keep that promise. That night, he filed the warrant request himself, every word written with precision, every signature signed with the gravity of justice long delayed. He didn't tell anyone until the order came through. He didn't want celebration, he wanted consequence. As the morning sun rose over Knoxville, Finch stood in front of the precinct window, watching the first patrol car pull away to prepare the arrest. He thought of all the hands Croft had shaken over the years, the trust he'd stolen, the lives he'd poisoned with deceit. He whispered, voice tight and resolute. He lived among them, fixing their cars and shaking their hands, all while carrying a secret that screamed. It was just after sunrise when the unmarked cars rolled onto Magnolia Avenue. The sky was soft gray, the kind of morning that usually meant calm. But calm was the one thing the town would never feel again. Barnaby Croft stood in front of his garage, wiping his hands on a rag as the police cruisers stopped in silence. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. When Finch stepped out of his car, Croft looked at him with the same expression he'd worn for 20 years. Steady, polite, unreadable. "Barney Croft?" Finch called, voice firm but quiet. Croft nodded. "Morning, Detective. Something wrong?" Finch didn't answer. He handed over the warrant. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, but his voice did not. "You're under arrest for the murder of Laura Bennett." The street fell still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Croft blinked once, twice, then exhaled, his shoulders lowering like a man accepting what he'd always known would come. The officers cuffed him gently, almost reverently, as if the weight of history demanded respect even for the guilty. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes, robes clutched, faces pale. No one spoke. As Croft was led to the car, Finch watched him glance toward the garage door, toward the wall, where dozens of thank you notes from customers hung pinned in neat rows. Notes that called him honest, trustworthy, kind. Finch's throat tightened. "You wore their praise like armor," he muttered under his breath. Inside the evidence van, one officer opened the small steel box retrieved from Croft's tool bench. Inside lay the past newspaper clippings, faded Polaroids, and a single silver locket wrapped in cloth. Inside it, a small photo of Laura Bennett, smiling in the sun. Finch stared for a long time, his reflection faint in the metal surface. He whispered, "You kept her close all this time, not out of guilt, but ownership." The line between memory and madness had lived in that locket for 40 years. By noon, the news had spread like wildfire. Knoxville's morning calm shattered into disbelief, outrage, and sorrow. Television crews parked outside the courthouse, microphones pointed at stunned neighbors, still trying to make sense of what they had seen. People spoke in fragments, unable to finish their sentences. "He fixed our car last month. He helped at the church fundraiser. He held the Bennett boy when the case broke." Every corner of the town seemed to breathe his name. The local diner, where Croft had eaten the same breakfast for years, locked its doors by afternoon. The church issued a brief statement asking the community to pray for peace, though no one in town could bring themselves to pray for him. In homes across the city, old photos were pulled out, school car washes, charity events, Little League teams, and there he was in all of them, smiling, helpful, safe. Eleanor Bennett, Laura's mother, hadn't spoken to the press in over 2 decades, but that day she stood on her porch, hand gripping the railing as if holding the earth steady. Her husband, Finch, beside her, kept his eyes on the reporters gathering below. She said only one thing. He sat at our table and told us he hoped she'd come home. Her voice broke halfway through the sentence. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The silence that followed carried the sound of every parent's worst nightmare. Detective Finch watched from his car down the street. He didn't approach. He didn't want to disturb their moment. For years, he had carried the Bennett's grief like a personal burden, replaying every failure, every wrong turn, every day lost. But today, for the first time, he felt the faint pulse of something that wasn't guilt, something closer to peace. The town hall bell rang at 3 o'clock. It wasn't planned. It simply happened. Someone had pulled the rope and let the sound echo through the valley. The ringing didn't honor Croft's capture. It mourned the years stolen from them all. Finch leaned against his car and whispered to himself, "They'll never look at kindness the same way again." The interrogation room was small and quiet, the hum of the fluorescent light almost unbearable. Barnaby Croft sat across from Detective Finch, hands folded neatly on the table, cuffs still in place. He looked older now, not from the passing of years, but from the collapse of his own disguise. Gone was the careful posture, the polite nods, the neighborly warmth. What sat in front of Finch was the hollow shell of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Finch didn't speak at first. He placed the silver locket on the table between them. Its chain coiled like a tiny serpent of memory. Croft stared at it for a long time, then sighed, not in remorse, but in resignation. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he murmured. She was upset, said she'd tell someone. "I panicked." Finch's voice stayed low. "You've had 40 years to panic. You didn't just take her life, you took her parents, her friends, this whole town's peace." Croft looked up, eyes dull. "You think I don't know that? You acted like you didn't." A long silence filled the room. Croft's gaze drifted toward the one-way glass. "You think people ever really see who we are?" he said softly. "I fixed their cars, helped with their fundraisers, prayed in their churches. No one ever looked closer. They saw what they wanted to." Finch clenched his jaw. "They saw what you made them see." Croft gave a faint, tired nod. "Same thing, isn't it?" The detective stood, sliding the locket back into its evidence bag. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Truth had finally spoken, and it sounded nothing like closure. It sounded like exhaustion. As Finch left the room, the hallway outside seemed brighter than it should have been. Reporters filled the building entrance, their voices echoing through the walls. Somewhere beyond the noise, a memorial candle flickered in the Bennett's window, the same one that had burned every year since 1983. Croft's words stayed with Finch as he walked out into the sunlight. They saw what they wanted to. He turned toward the flashing cameras, ignoring the questions. He knew the only line that mattered, the one history would remember. He had been invited to every vigil pretending to mourn the life he stole. By the time the trial began, Knoxville had already split in two, those who demanded to see Barnaby Croft condemned publicly, and those who still couldn't accept that the man who'd fixed their brakes and led church drives was capable of killing and one 8-year-old girl. The courthouse steps overflowed every day, with cameras, candles, and faces etched in disbelief. Some came for justice. Others came just to confirm that it was real. Inside, the air was heavy but silent. Reporters lined the back rows, pens still, waiting for something to happen that words could not capture. Croft entered the courtroom wearing a plain gray suit. No handcuffs this time, but his wrists looked as though they still carried the memory of them. He didn't look up when the Bennetts walked in. He didn't look at anyone. Detective Finch sat 2 rows behind the prosecution. For him, this wasn't about victory. It was about witnessing the ending he'd promised to deliver. Across the aisle, Eleanor Bennett sat with folded hands, her expression neither angry nor forgiving, only steady. The decades of grief had stripped her down to something beyond rage, the quiet endurance of a mother who'd already lost everything once and refused to lose her dignity too. When the judge entered, every sound in the room seemed to vanish. The opening statements were simple: the DNA, the confession, the evidence, each piece spoken like a nail hammered into truth's coffin. The defense didn't fight the facts. They couldn't. Instead, Croft entered an Alford plea, acknowledging the weight of the evidence without admitting guilt outright. It was the final manipulation of a man who'd built his life on lies, one last attempt to control the story. But this time, the story wasn't his to tell. The prosecution's final slide showed the silver locket, now sealed in evidence, glinting under the fluorescent light, the same light that had burned over Finch's desk for half his life. He leaned forward slightly, exhaling a single breath. "We kept our promise, Laura." When Detective Finch took the stand, the room shifted. For years, his voice had only been heard in press conferences and quiet vigils. But today, his words would be written into history. He adjusted the microphone, looked at the jury, and spoke with the calm steadiness of a man who'd carried the truth longer than anyone else. "I met the Bennetts the night their daughter disappeared," he began. "Back then, we still believed that justice came quickly, that the world made sense if you just worked hard enough. But this case, it taught me that time doesn't heal. It only waits. Until someone's brave enough to open the door again." He paused, eyes flicking toward Eleanor Bennett in the front row. Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white, her wedding band dull under the courtroom lights. Finch's voice lowered. "We made a promise to Laura's parents that she would never become a forgotten name on a shelf. It took 40 years, but we kept it. And that's why I'm here today." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words sinking into every wall. The prosecutor nodded, stepping back. No cross-examination followed. None was needed. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her frail frame trembling but unbroken. Her voice was quiet, but every word landed like a strike. "He took her from us, but he doesn't get to take what's left. I've spent my life keeping her memory alive, and I'll keep doing it long after this trial is over." She turned her gaze toward Croft, the man who'd once smiled at her from across the street. "You told me once that God forgives everything. I don't." No one breathed. The judge cleared his throat, his own eyes glassy as he turned to the clerk. The verdict was formal, procedural, anticlimactic, compared to the years that had led to it. Life in prison without parole. When the gavel came down, it sounded like thunder, not of closure, but of permanence. Finch watched Eleanor close her eyes, exhaling the breath she'd been holding for 40 years. The gavel didn't close her story, Finch said quietly to himself. It made sure no one could rewrite it again. Winter returned to Knoxville the following year, bringing with it the same quiet stillness that had followed Laura's disappearance decades ago. But this time, the silence didn't carry fear, it carried remembrance. The first annual Laura Bennett Memorial was held at I.C. King Park, overlooking the same stretch of river where volunteers once searched for her in vain. Now, the banks were lined with candles, their flames trembling against the cold air. Each light represented a promise that her story would never fade again. Eleanor Bennett sat in the front row, wrapped in a deep blue shawl Laura had given her for Mother's Day in 1982. Time had taken much from her, her daughter, her youth, her voice some days, but it had not taken her resolve. She watched as students, neighbors, and officers from 3 generations gathered in silence. Among them was Detective Finch, no longer in uniform, his hair now streaked with gray, his posture slower but unbowed. He stepped up to the podium, holding a single piece of paper. His voice was steady, but the weight in it was unmistakable. 40 years ago, he said, we made a promise to never let Laura's story be buried. Tonight, we keep that promise, not just for her, but for every soul still waiting to be heard. A gust of wind flickered the candles, but none went out. The crowd stood together, shoulders touching, breath visible in the cold. Finch looked toward Eleanor, and she gave him the smallest nod, one that said everything words could not. In that moment, Knoxville wasn't defined by tragedy anymore. It was defined by memory and the endurance of those who refused to forget. The bell tower at the edge of the park began to toll softly, echoing across the river. Each note seemed to carry her name. Months after the memorial, something remarkable took root in Laura's name. The Laura Bennett Women in STEM Scholarship was announced by the University of Tennessee, a program designed to help young women chase the dreams Laura never had the chance to fulfill. Her childhood love for science had been legendary in her family. The girl who built a homemade telescope from spare glass, who once told her father she wanted to understand the stars, not just look at them. Now, her name would open doors for others to do exactly that. The scholarship's inaugural recipient was a 9-year-old engineering student from Memphis named Alina Carter. In her acceptance speech, her voice trembled but carried strength. "Laura never got to live her future," she said, "but through this, she helps build ours." Her words rippled through the auditorium, leaving even the most stoic faces wet with tears. Detective Finch sat quietly in the audience, a plaque resting on his lap. He'd been honored that same evening for his lifetime service and commitment to cold case justice, his work now part of the state's law enforcement curriculum. When called to speak, he didn't talk about DNA, evidence, or crime scenes. He talked about time. "Justice isn't fast," he said, his voice low. "It's faithful. It waits for us to be ready. And when we finally are, it answers." After the ceremony, Eleanor approached him. Her steps were slow, her voice softer than before. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Finch smiled faintly. "No," he said, "we did." Outside, the sky was clear, winter stars scattered like quiet witnesses. Finch looked up for a long while before heading home. For the first time in decades, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt still, but not empty, as though Laura's story had finally settled into its rightful place, not in tragedy, but in purpose. That night, the scholarship website received hundreds of messages, not from donors or alumni, but from mothers, daughters, and strangers who'd followed her case for years. Each message said the same thing in different words. She didn't just die, she changed something. Years later, Detective Finch finally retired. His badge, worn smooth by time, sat on his desk beside the faded photo of Laura that had followed him from one precinct to another. In that picture, she was forever 18 wind in her hair, light in her eyes, the promise of a future that had once been stolen but was now, in some quiet way, restored. Finch ran his thumb across the frame, exhaled deeply, and closed the file one last time, but the story never left him. Some cases stay open inside you, no matter what the paperwork says. Every winter, he returned to I.C. King Park, where the candles still lined the riverbank and the bell tolled in her name. People came from across the state, now students she'd inspired, parents who'd found strength in her story, officers who joined law enforcement because of her case. The tradition had grown beyond grief. It had become a movement of remembrance. That night, Finch stood with the crowd as snow began to fall, soft and soundless. He lit a single candle, its flame trembling against the wind. Around him, hundreds of others did the same. From a distance, it looked like the stars themselves had descended onto the earth. He thought of Eleanor, now gone but never forgotten, and how her voice once carried the last word of every vigil. Light stays. The bell began to toll again, slow, deep, certain. Each ring stretched across the water, as though marking the distance between what was lost and what was finally found. Finch lifted his face toward the cold sky, watching his breath fade into the dark, and whispered, "You made them remember, Laura. You made us all remember." The camera would fade here from the glow of candlelight to a slow montage. The scholarship plaque, Finch's badge encased in glass, a child tracing Laura's name on the memorial stone. The sound of wind over water would linger until one final shot, the flame of a single candle burning steady in the snow. And over it, the final words would rise like a promise kept. In a city of thousands, one young girl refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice.